The chandeliers of Le Jardin d'Etoiles caught the late afternoon sun like captured lightning, scattering prismatic light across white tablecloths that had been pressed so many times they held creases like memory. The restaurant occupied the entire top floor of the Belmont Tower in downtown Montreal, a glass-walled sanctuary where the wealthy came not just to eat, but to be seen eating. From this height, the St. Lawrence River looked like a silver ribbon someone had carelessly tossed across the landscape, and the sounds of the city below were muted into insignificance. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. Amélie Fontaine moved between the tables with the practiced grace of someone who had learned to make herself small in spaces designed for the large. At 28, she carried herself with a quiet dignity that some guests mistook for aloofness, though those who looked closer might have noticed the calluses on her hands from double shifts, or the way her eyes held a particular kind of weariness that had nothing to do with physical exhaustion. Her dark hair was pulled back in the regulation chignon, and her uniform, black dress, white apron, sensible shoes that had been resoled twice, was immaculate despite the fact that she'd been on her feet since 6 that morning. The lunch service had been brutal. A corporate event for a pharmaceutical company had brought in 80 guests who treated the staff like animated furniture, snapping fingers and making demands without ever quite looking at the faces of those serving them. Amélie had smiled through it all, her face a pleasant mask she'd perfected over 5 years of working in high-end establishments. She'd learned early that in restaurants like this, waitresses were supposed to be invisible until needed, then miraculously present, then invisible again. Now, in the lull between lunch and dinner, she stood at the server station folding napkins with mechanical precision, her fingers creating perfect swans from starched linen. Beside her, Marcus, the sous chef who'd worked his way up from dishwasher over 15 years, was prepping mise en place for the evening rush, his dark hands moving with the confidence of someone who could dice an onion blindfolded. "You hear about table 7? He asked without looking up from the carrots he was julienning. "Reserved for 6:30. Some big shot from the Emirates. Dropped 5 grand on wine before even arriving." Amélie's stomach tightened slightly, though her expression didn't change. Big spenders were a double-edged sword. Tips could be generous, but expectations were astronomical, and any perceived slight could result in complaints that traveled straight to management. She'd seen good servers fired over nothing more than failing to smile widely enough. "Who's taking it?" she asked, though part of her already knew the answer. Henri, the head waiter, had a way of assigning the most demanding tables to her. He claimed it was because she was reliable, but Amélie suspected it was because she never complained, never pushed back, never asked for anything different. "You are, apparently," Marcus confirmed, his voice carrying a note of sympathy. Henri said specifically, "Something about you being refined enough for this particular guest." The word refined in Henri's vocabulary usually meant willing to take abuse without breaking. Amélie had been refined through countless encounters with guests who treated service workers as props in their personal dramas. She'd been refined through tips left as coins scattered across tables like insults, through propositions whispered while wives weren't looking, through condescension delivered with smiles that never reached the eyes. She finished the napkin swan and added it to the growing collection. "What else do we know about him?" "Sheikh Khalid Al-Mansour," Marcus said, consulting the reservation notes that had been printed out and clipped to the board. "Owns half of Dubai's real estate, apparently. In Montreal for some business acquisition. Traveling with an assistant and a translator, though the notes say he speaks English. Known for..." Marcus paused, his expression darkening slightly. "Known for being particular about service standards." Particular was restaurant code for difficult. Possibly abusive. Certainly someone who would find fault because finding fault was how such people demonstrated their power. The restaurant was beautiful in the late afternoon light, but Amélie had long ago stopped seeing the beauty. She saw instead the water spots on the crystal that would need to be polished again, the slightly crooked painting that would need straightening before service, the scuff mark on the floor near table 12 that no amount of cleaning could quite remove. She saw the architecture of her own exhaustion, built from 10-hour shifts and the constant performance of deference. Through the western windows, Montreal stretched out in all its contradictions. Old stone buildings pressed against glass towers, church spires competing with corporate headquarters, the French colonial past wrestling with the globalized present. Amélie had been born in this city, in the East End where her family had lived for 5 generations, where her grandmother still spoke the Quebecois French that marked them as local, as working class, as people who belonged to the old Montreal rather than this new one of luxury condos and imported millionaires. Her grandmother, Marguerite, lived in a rent-controlled apartment in Hochelaga-Maisonneuve, the same neighborhood where she'd raised 3 children on a seamstress's wages after Amélie's grandfather had died young. Marguerite was 82 now, her hands twisted with arthritis, her memory beginning to slip at the edges. But she still spoke perfect Parisian French, the French she'd learned from her own mother, who had immigrated from Lyon in 1947 with nothing but a suitcase and a fierce determination that her children would never forget where they came from. It was Marguerite who had taught Amélie that language could be armor and weapon both. "Speak properly," she used to say, correcting Amélie's casual Montreal French with its dropped syllables and borrowed English words. "Speak like someone who cannot be dismissed. They can take everything from you, ma petite, but they cannot take how you speak unless you let them." Amélie had taken those lessons to heart. She'd studied literature at JEP, reading Proust and Flaubert and Camus until she could recite passages from memory. She'd worked on her accent, smoothing away the markers of her working-class neighborhood until she could speak with the polished neutrality of a CBC announcer or the formal precision of a diplomat. She'd learned to code-switch effortlessly between the French of her family and the French of the academy, between the English of service work and the English of her own private thoughts. But literature degrees didn't pay for medical care, and her grandmother's prescriptions cost $300 a month. So Amélie worked at Le Jardin d'Étoiles, where she earned enough to keep the lights on in her own studio apartment and still send money to Marguerite. She worked double shifts when her grandmother needed new glasses, triple shifts when the building's heat had broken down last winter. She worked through her own exhaustion, her own dreams of perhaps teaching one day, her own secret writing, poetry she kept in a journal she never showed anyone. The poetry was her real self, the place where she kept the observations that would get her fired if she ever spoke them aloud. In those pages, she wrote about the casual cruelty of wealth, the way money convinced people they were exempt from basic human decency. She wrote about the other servers, their private struggles and secret strengths. She wrote about the city itself, the Montreal that existed beneath the tourist version, the neighborhoods where people still knew their neighbors' names and left their doors unlocked. Amélie. Henri's voice cut through her thoughts like a knife through butter. The head waiter materialized beside her, his thin face pinched with what she recognized as pre-service anxiety. Henri was 45 and had been at Le Jardin d'Étoiles for 12 years, working his way up from busboy to his current position. He ran a tight ship, but the pressure from management had made him brittle, quick to panic at any deviation from perfection. "The Sheik's party has arrived early," Henri said, his accent carrying traces of the private schools his parents had bankrupted themselves to afford. "They're waiting in the lounge. Chef wants to know their preferences before they're seated. I need you to go speak with them, take any special requests, ensure everything is perfect. This is important, Amélie." The owner himself called about this reservation. Amélie straightened her apron and nodded. "Of course. I'll go now." "And Amélie?" Henri caught her arm, his grip just slightly too tight. "Please, no mistakes tonight. I know you're tired, but this one matters. Smile. Be attentive. Make them feel special. Make them feel special. As if their money wasn't already doing that. As if the entire structure of restaurants like this wasn't designed to convince wealthy people that they were indeed special, that they deserved to be catered to, that those serving them were a different category of human entirely." But she simply nodded again and made her way toward the lounge, a smaller room adjacent to the main dining area where VIP guests could wait away from the common folk. The lounge was decorated in deep burgundy and gold, with leather armchairs that probably cost more than Amélie's yearly rent and abstract art on the walls that she privately thought looked like someone had sneezed paint onto canvas and called it genius. 3 men stood near the floor-to-ceiling windows, silhouetted against the lowering sun. Even from behind, she could tell which was the Sheikh, the one in the center, the one the other 2 orbited like moons around a planet. He wore traditional white robes that seemed to glow in the amber light, a gold-trimmed bisht draped over his shoulders like a declaration of status. The two men flanking him wore expensive Western suits, one holding a tablet, the other speaking quietly into a phone. Amélie took a breath, arranged her face into what she thought of as her service expression. Pleasant, neutral, ready to accommodate, and approached with quiet steps. "Good evening, gentlemen," she said in English, her voice carrying the professional warmth that was neither too familiar nor too distant. "Welcome to Le Jardin d'Étoiles. I'm Amélie, and I'll have the pleasure of serving you this evening. I understand you've arrived a bit early, and we're honored to." The sheik turned, and the rest of her greeting died in her throat. He was younger than she'd expected, perhaps 35, with sharp features that might have been handsome if not for the expression of supreme boredom that settled over them like a mask. His eyes swept over her with the same attention one might give to an inanimate object, registering her presence without really seeing her. There was something in his gaze that made her feel suddenly transparent, as if she were made of glass and he were looking straight through her to something more important beyond. "You speak English?" he asked, his accent polished by British schools and American business dealings. "Thank God. I was worried everything would be in that ridiculous French you people insist on here." The man with the tablet, his assistant, presumably, shifted uncomfortably. The one on the phone continued his conversation as if nothing had happened. Amélie's smile didn't waver, though something cold settled in her chest. "We're happy to accommodate in English, of course. May I ask if there are any dietary restrictions or preferences I should convey to our chef before?" "Where is your manager?" the sheik interrupted, not bothering to lower his voice. Around them, the few other guests in the lounge looked up, some with curiosity, others with the dawning anticipation of people sensing drama. "I was told this was Montreal's finest restaurant, but they send out." He gestured vaguely at her with one ring-adorned hand. "This? To take my order." The assistant cleared his throat. "Sheikh Al-Mansour, perhaps we should." "Be quiet, Samir." The sheik's attention remained fixed on Amélie with the focus of someone who had found a flaw and intended to worry at it. "Tell me, girl, how long have you worked here?" "5 years, sir." Amélie kept her voice steady, professional. She'd dealt with difficult guests before. This was just another performance, another test of how much she could endure while maintaining that smile. 5 years. He said it as if it were an accusation. "And in 5 years, they've never taught you that important guests deserve better than some common waitress?" "I asked for the sommelier. I asked for the head waiter, and instead they send." He paused, looking her up and down with undisguised disdain. "This." The words hung in the air like smoke, and Amélie felt every eye in the lounge turn toward her. This was the moment that defined service work, the moment when you had to decide whether to defend yourself or to continue the performance, to protect your dignity or to protect your job. The mathematics of survival were simple and brutal. She needed this job more than she needed to be treated like a human being. "I apologize if there's been a misunderstanding, sir," she said, her voice carefully modulated to show deference without quite showing submission. "I'll be happy to fetch Henri, our head waiter, if you'd prefer. Our sommelier, Pascal, is preparing the wine cellar for your arrival as we speak. I was simply hoping to take any preliminary requests to ensure your experience is." "You want to know my request?" The sheik stepped closer, and Amélie caught the scent of expensive cologne, something woody and intense that probably cost more than her weekly paycheck. "My request is for staff who understand their place, who don't presume to address me as if we're equals, who have been trained properly in how to serve people of quality." People of quality. The phrase landed like a slap, and for just a moment, Amélie's careful mask slipped. She felt the familiar burn behind her eyes, the tight constriction in her throat that came from swallowing words that wanted desperately to be spoken. In her mind, she composed a response, sharp and perfect, the kind of cutting observation that would deflate his pomposity and expose the hollowness beneath. But she said nothing, because that's what people like her did. They said nothing and smiled and survived. "I'll fetch Henri immediately," she managed, already turning away. "Wait." The The single word stopped her. The sheik moved around to face her again, and there was something almost curious in his expression now, as if he were examining an insect under glass. You understand me well enough. Your English is adequate if unrefined. So let me be crystal clear about my expectations for this evening. He began listing demands, each one delivered with the casual certainty of someone who had never been told no. The table must be positioned away from all other diners. The temperature must be exactly 22 degrees Celsius. The wine must be decanted precisely 30 minutes before serving. No ice in the water unless explicitly requested. No interruptions during the meal unless summoned. No one was to approach the table until he signaled. Amélie listened, mentally cataloging each requirement, her mind automatically calculating the logistics of fulfilling them. Some were reasonable if particular. Others were designed purely to demonstrate power, to make the staff jump through hoops simply because they could be made to jump. Through it all, she maintained eye contact and nodded at appropriate intervals, giving no indication of the storm brewing beneath her calm surface. This was what 5 years in high-end service had taught her, how to divide herself into the part that performed and the part that observed, the part that smiled and the part that kept meticulous score. And one more thing, the sheik added, his voice dropping to something that might have been mistaken for confidential if not for the edge of cruelty in it. I don't want you serving my table. You're clearly inexperienced with clients of my caliber. Send someone more appropriate. The assistant, Samir, looked mortified. Sheikh Al-Mansour, I'm sure she's perfectly. Did I ask your opinion, Samir? The sheik's voice could have frozen nitrogen. No? Then keep it to yourself. Now, girl, run along and fetch someone who actually knows what they're doing. Amélie gave a small nod and turned away, her movements controlled and precise. She walked back toward the main dining room, her posture perfect, her pace neither rushed nor slow. Only when she passed through the swinging doors into the kitchen did she allow herself to stop, to lean against the stainless steel counter, to take one shaking breath. Marcus looked up from his prep work and took in her expression. That bad? I need Henri, she said, her voice flat. The sheik has requested different service. He what? Marcus set down his knife, his face darkening. That pompous. It's fine. The lie came automatically. It's his right to request a different server. I'll take one of the other tables tonight. But it wasn't fine and they both knew it. Henri appeared moments later, summoned by the kitchen's gossip network, his face already tense with displeasure. What happened? Amélie recounted the interaction with clinical precision, leaving out her own feelings, focusing only on the facts. The sheik wanted different service. He had specific requirements. He felt she wasn't experienced enough for his standards. Henri's expression cycled through several emotions: irritation, concern, calculation. This is unacceptable, he said, though Amélie couldn't tell if he meant the sheik's behavior or her failure to satisfy him. You should have been more. Amélie, you know how important this is. Did you do something to offend him? The question was a knife between her ribs. I greeted him professionally and attempted to take his requests. But something must have. Henri trailed off, running a hand through his carefully styled hair. Fine. I'll take the table myself. But Amélie, this reflects poorly on all of us. Try to be more mindful in the future. She wanted to ask what exactly she should have been mindful of. More obsequious? More submissive? Should she have bowed? Scraped? Apologized for existing in his line of sight? But she knew better than to ask questions that had no good answers. The evening service began, and Amélie was reassigned to tables 14 through 17, a section in the corner that was considered less prestigious but no less demanding. She moved through her duties with mechanical efficiency, taking orders and delivering food, refilling water glasses and clearing plates. She smiled at each guest, engaged in small talk when it was expected, and made herself useful without making herself memorable. But part of her attention remained on table 7, where Henri was performing an elaborate dance of deference for Sheikh Al-Mansour. She watched the sheik gesture imperiously, watched Henri bow and scrape, watched the entire transaction of dignity for money play out in real time. The Sheikh's party ordered the most expensive items on the menu without looking at prices, sent back 2 dishes for reasons that seemed more about power than actual problems, and treated Henri with the same casual dismissal they'd shown her. At one point, as she passed by with a tray of desserts for table 15, she heard the Sheikh speaking, not in English this time, but in Arabic. His voice carried the same tone of amused contempt she'd heard earlier, and though she didn't understand the words, she understood the meaning well enough. He was entertaining his companions by mocking the staff, by describing the restaurant and its workers as quaint curiosities, exotic pets performing tricks for treats. Samir, the assistant, looked deeply uncomfortable. The third man laughed at appropriate intervals but seemed to be watching his phone more than engaging. The shift stretched on. Amélie's feet ached in a way that was beyond simple pain, settling into a deep throb that she knew from experience would linger for days. Her lower back had developed a persistent knot from carrying heavy trays, and her face hurt from smiling. She'd been on her feet for 14 hours with only a 15-minute break to wolf down some bread and cheese in the staff room. During that break, she'd texted her grandmother, "Working late tonight. Don't wait up. Love you." The response came quickly, "Work hard but not too hard, ma chérie. Remember, you are worth more than they know." Amélie had stared at those words for a long moment, feeling tears prick at her eyes. Her grandmother saw her in a way nobody at the restaurant did, not as a function, not as a service provider, but as a whole person with value independent of her usefulness. Back on the floor, she overheard snippets of conversation from her own tables. Table 14 was a couple celebrating an anniversary, sweet and undemanding, leaving compliments with their payment. Table 15 was a group of young professionals showing off for each other, loud and slightly drunk but generous with tips. Table 16 was a family with 2 small children who made a mess but apologized profusely and left extra money for the trouble. Table 17 was an elderly woman dining alone, reading a book between courses, who looked up at Amélie with recognition in her eyes, the recognition of one woman who understood what it meant to move through the world accommodating others. These were the guests who made the work bearable, the ones who saw her even briefly, the ones who understood that being served didn't mean they were being served by lesser beings. But her attention kept drifting back to table 7, where Sheikh Al-Mansour was holding court. At some point during the meal, a small crowd had gathered, other wealthy diners who recognized the Sheikh or simply recognized the markers of extreme wealth and wanted to orbit it. He entertained them all with stories told in English punctuated with Arabic phrases, describing his business empire with the casualness of someone describing a hobby. "Montreal is charming," she heard him say at one point. "Quaint, really, like a European city that time forgot. The people here cling so desperately to their French identity, as if speaking a language makes them civilized. But of course, true sophistication is something else entirely. It's something that can't be taught to just anyone." The comment was clearly aimed at the restaurant staff, at the city itself, at everyone who wasn't part of his elevated circle. Several of his audience laughed, and Amélie felt something hot and bright flare in her chest. Not just anger, but a deep sense of injustice at the ease with which people like him could dismiss entire cities, entire cultures, entire populations. She thought about her grandmother again, about 5 generations of her family who had built lives in this city. She thought about her own education, her literature degree that she'd earned while working nights at a grocery store, her knowledge of Proust and Sartre and all the French writers who had shaped Western philosophy. She thought about the poetry she wrote, the observations she made, the interior life that was as rich and complex as anything Sheikh Al-Mansour had ever experienced. But what did any of that matter here, in this space where value was measured purely in wealth? The evening wore on. At 11, the Sheikh's party finally finished their meal, a 3-hour affair that had tied up Henri and the entire kitchen. The bill came to over $4,000. The Sheikh paid with a black credit card that seemed to absorb light and left a tip of exactly 10%, which was standard but not generous given the complexity of the service. As they prepared to leave, Sheikh Al-Mansour stood and stretched with the unselfconscious ease of someone who had never worried about taking up space. He said something else in Arabic to his companions, and they all laughed. A joke at someone's expense, surely. Amélie was clearing table 16 when she heard it. The laugh that followed was particularly loud, and the Sheikh's voice carried clearly. Au moins nous en avons pas du supporter la serveuse incompetent. J'ai cru tuer all eight fondre en larmes quand je l'ai renvoyé. Est gens là sont tellement sensibles. At least we didn't have to endure the incompetent waitress. I thought she was going to burst into tears when I dismissed her. These people are so sensitive. The words were in perfect Parisian French, the accent flawless, the grammar impeccable. The kind of French that was meant to exclude, to create an insider language, to allow him to mock the staff in what he assumed was a language they wouldn't understand or wouldn't understand well enough to catch the nuance. Amélie froze with a water glass in hand. Something inside her shifted, a tectonic movement of self-respect colliding with suppressed anger. She thought about her grandmother's words. They can take everything from you, but they cannot take how you speak unless you let them. She thought about 5 years of swallowing indignities. She thought about the poetry she'd never shown anyone, the observations she'd kept silent. She thought about every time she'd made herself small so someone else could feel big. The Sheikh was walking toward the exit now, his entourage following. He would leave the restaurant, get into whatever luxury car was waiting, return to whatever 5-star hotel suite he was occupying, and never think about her again. She would remain the incompetent waitress, a minor character in his story, easily dismissed and quickly forgotten. Unless, Amélie set down the water glass with careful precision. She smoothed her apron. She took a breath that seemed to reach all the way down to the bedrock of who she was, past the service expression and the careful deference, down to the girl who had read Voltaire by flashlight under her covers, who had memorized Baudelaire, who had written essays on Camus that her professors had praised as remarkably insightful. Then she walked across the dining room floor, her steps steady and sure, and positioned herself directly in the Sheikh's path to the door. The Sheikh nearly walked into her before he noticed her presence. He stopped short, his expression cycling from surprise to irritation to something that might have been recognition, though clearly he didn't quite place her as the waitress he'd dismissed earlier. She was, after all, part of the invisible class. "Excusez-moi," she said, her voice clear and measured, each word articulated with the precision of a Paris conservatory graduate. "Pardonnez mon audace, monsieur, mais j'ai cru comprendre que vous parlez français. J'ai me demandé si je pouvais clarifier quelques malentendus concernant votre expérience ce soir." "Excuse me. Forgive my boldness, sir. But I understood that you speak French. I was wondering if I might clarify some misunderstandings about your experience this evening." The change in his expression was immediate and profound. The boredom evaporated, replaced by something between shock and affront. Behind him, Samir's eyes widened. The third man looked up from his phone for the first time all evening. "Vous parlez français?" The Sheikh's question came out sharp, almost accusatory, as if her speaking French was itself an act of insubordination. "Oui, monsieur, je parle français." Amélie kept her voice perfectly neutral, but she allowed herself a small smile. Not the service expression, but something more genuine. "En fait, c'est ma langue maternelle. J'ai grandi à Montréal, vous voyez. Ma famille est ici depuis 5 generations. Yes, sir. I speak French. In fact, it's my mother tongue. I grew up in Montreal, you see. My family has been here for 5 generations." The Sheikh's face was doing something complicated, a mixture of emotions fighting for dominance. Around them, the restaurant had gone quiet. Henri had appeared from the kitchen, his face pale, clearly expecting disaster. Marcus was visible through the service window, watching with unconcealed interest. The remaining diners had all stopped their conversations to observe this unexpected confrontation. "I see," the Sheikh said, switching back to English with the air of someone trying to regain control of a situation that had slipped sideways. "Then you understood everything," Amélie supplied helpfully. "Oh yes, my French is, as you might say, adequate, perhaps even refined. I particularly appreciated your observation about incompetent waitresses and sensitive people. It was very illuminating." The word illuminating hung in the air like a challenge. Samir made a small noise that might have been a suppressed laugh or a groan. The Sheikh's jaw tightened. "I don't appreciate your tone," he said, drawing himself up to his full height, attempting to reassert the power dynamic through physical presence. And I don't appreciate being called incompetent in a language you assumed I wouldn't understand, Amélie replied, her voice still calm, still professional, but with an edge now, a blade hidden in silk, particularly when my incompetence consisted of greeting you politely and attempting to accommodate your requests. But perhaps we have different definitions of competence. How dare you? The sheik took a step forward, and for a moment, Amélie wondered if she'd pushed too far. If this was the moment she'd be fired, escorted out, made an example of. But Henri stepped in, his face a rictus of professional panic. Sheikh Al-Mansour, please accept my profound apologies. Amélie, return to your duties immediately. I'll handle. Non. The single word, spoken in French, stopped Henri mid-sentence. Amélie looked directly at the sheik, holding his gaze with a steadiness she hadn't known she possessed. Avec tout le respect que je vous dois, monsieur, vous êtes entré dans ce restaurant avec l'assurance que votre argent vous donne le droit de nous traiter comme d'objets. Vous m'avez jugé incompetent avant même que j'aie pu démontrer mes competences. Vous avez insulté ma ville, ma langue, et mes collègues, and presumant que nous étions trop ignorants ou trop insignifiants pour comprendre. With all due respect, sir, you entered this restaurant assuming your money gave you the right to treat us as objects. You judged me incompetent before I could even demonstrate my abilities. You insulted my city, my language, and my colleagues, presuming we were too ignorant or too insignificant to understand. The silence that followed was absolute. Amélie could hear her own heartbeat, feel the adrenaline coursing through her system, the particular clarity that comes from having nothing left to lose. You're fired, the sheik said flatly. I don't think so, came a new voice. Everyone turned to find Madame Corinne Beaumont standing at the entrance to the dining room, her elegant frame silhouetted against the ambient light. At 72, Corinne was the actual owner of Le Jardin d'Étoiles, a woman who had built the restaurant from nothing over 40 years, who had learned the business from her father and transformed it into one of Montreal's most prestigious establishments. She appeared at the restaurant only occasionally now, having largely retired, but when she did appear, everyone snapped to attention. Corinne moved through the space with the unhurried grace of someone who owned not just the restaurant but the very ground it stood on. She was dressed impeccably as always, her silver hair styled in a classic chignon, her eyes sharp and assessing behind designer glasses. Madame Beaumont, Henri stammered. I apologize for the disturbance. This is. I heard what this is, Corinne said calmly. She looked at the sheik with the expression of someone examining a particularly unimpressive specimen. I heard it from my office, in fact. The walls are quite thin when one raises one's voice. She turned to Amélie. Continue, please, in French if you prefer. I'd like to hear the rest. Amélie felt something unlock in her chest. She had met Madame Beaumont only a handful of times. The owner rarely interacted directly with service staff. But there was something in the older woman's expression that looked like understanding, or perhaps recognition. I was simply explaining, Amélie said, continuing in French now that she'd been given permission, that respect is not something that can be purchased with a credit card, that treating people with basic human dignity costs nothing, and that assuming ignorance based on someone's occupation is its own form of ignorance. Eloquent, Corinne observed, and accurate. Your French is excellent, by the way. Parisian school. My grandmother, Amélie said. She immigrated from Lyon. She believed language was a form of resistance. A wise woman. Corinne turned her attention back to the sheik, switching to English now. Sheikh Al-Mansour, I believe you've had a very educational evening. I hope the meal was satisfactory, though I suspect the company was not quite what you expected. The sheik's face had gone through several shades of red and was now settling into something between outrage and calculation. This is completely unacceptable. Your staff has been insolent, unprofessional. Accurate, Corinne corrected. The word you're looking for is accurate and eloquent. My staff, particularly Amélie here, has been both. Now, I'm going to suggest something radical. You could apologize. Apologize. The word came out strangled. I'm the customer. I'm the one who was rude, condescending, dismissive. Corinne supplied. Yes, you were all of those things. I've been in this business for 45 years, Sheikh Al-Mansour. I've seen every variation of wealthy person who believes their money exempts them from basic decency. You're not unique. You're not even particularly interesting. Samir made a choking sound. The third man was openly staring now, his phone forgotten. The sheik drew himself up, preparing what was clearly going to be a devastating response. A deployment of his full arsenal of wealth and influence and connections. But before he could speak, Corinne raised one hand. Before you threaten to ruin my restaurant or my reputation or whatever it is you're preparing to threaten, she said, her voice mild. Let me save you the trouble. I'm 72 years old. I've survived the recession of '82, the ice storm of '98, the financial crisis of 2008, and a global pandemic. I've outlasted 3 husbands, for lawsuits, and more health inspectors than I can count. Do you really think a bad Yelp review from someone who can't treat service staff with respect is going to be what takes me down? The sheik's mouth opened, closed, opened again. However, Corinne continued, I'm also a businesswoman, so here's what's going to happen. You're going to leave my restaurant now. Your bill has been comped, no charge for tonight. In exchange, you're going to never return. And you're going to forget you were ever here. Does that sound fair? You're kicking me out? The sheik seemed genuinely shocked, as if this had never happened to him before. Probably hadn't. I'm releasing you from the burden of dining somewhere that clearly doesn't meet your standards. Corinne, continue. Henri said with a smile that was all teeth and no warmth. Surely there are other establishments in Montreal that would be more accommodating of your particular needs. The sheik stood frozen for a moment, his face a study in conflicting impulses. Amélie could see him calculating the social cost of making a scene versus the cost to his pride of backing down, the potential embarrassment of being forcibly removed versus the embarrassment of having been bested by a waitress and an elderly woman. Finally, he turned to Samir and snapped something in Arabic. Samir nodded quickly, relief evident on his face, and moved toward the door. The third man followed without a word, clearly eager to escape the situation. But the sheik paused at the threshold and turned back one last time. His eyes found Amélie's, and in them she saw something she hadn't expected. Not quite respect, but a kind of grudging acknowledgement. He inclined his head slightly, the barest minimum of a gesture, before sweeping out into the Montreal night. The moment the door closed behind him, the restaurant erupted. The remaining diners broke into spontaneous applause, some standing, others raising their wine glasses in salute. Marcus appeared from the kitchen with several other staff members, all of them grinning. Henri looked like he might faint. Amélie stood in the center of it all, feeling suddenly unmoored, the adrenaline that had carried her through the confrontation beginning to ebb away. Her hands were shaking. Her legs felt unsteady. She had just done the most reckless thing of her professional life, and she couldn't quite believe she was still standing, still employed, still breathing. Corinne approached her and placed one elegant hand on her shoulder. Walk with me, she said quietly, to my office. The request was not optional. As they moved through the restaurant, Amélie caught glimpses of her co-workers' faces. Marcus giving her a thumbs up, Henri looking stricken, the other servers wearing expressions of awe and concern. She had no idea what was about to happen, but she followed Corinne through the kitchen and down a hallway she'd never been permitted to enter before. The office was smaller than Amélie had imagined, lined with photographs that chronicled the restaurant's history. There was Corinne as a young woman, standing beside her father outside what must have been the original location. There she was cutting a ribbon at this building's opening. There she was shaking hands with various dignitaries and celebrities over the decades. Corinne gestured to a chair and took her own seat behind a desk that was clearly an antique, its surface marked with the wear of decades. She poured 2 glasses of cognac from a crystal decanter without asking if Amélie wanted one, and pushed one across the desk. Drink, she said. You've earned it. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. Amélie took a sip. The cognac burned pleasantly, warming her from the inside. She waited, uncertain, for whatever judgment was coming. My grandmother was a seamstress in Marseille, Corinne said suddenly. She came to Montreal in 1939, running from what she knew was coming. She spoke no English, very little Quebecois French. Her Provençal accent marked her as foreign, as other. She took work wherever she could find it, including in restaurants where the owners assumed she was too stupid to understand when they mocked her. Amélie looked up, surprised. She taught me very young that language is power, Corinne continued. That how we speak, when we speak, what we choose to say or not say, these are choices that define us. She also taught me that silence in the face of cruelty is its own form of cruelty. She took a sip of her own cognac. I've been watching you, Amélie. For all 5 years you've been here. Do you know what I see? Amélie shook her head, not trusting her voice. I see someone who is vastly overqualified for the work she's doing. Someone who holds herself back, makes herself small, accepts mistreatment as if it's simply part of the job description. Someone who has been taught that survival means silence. Corinne leaned forward. I also see someone who, when pushed far enough, has the spine to stand up to a man who believes his wealth makes him untouchable. That interests me. I shouldn't have, Amélie started. You should have done it years ago, Corinne interrupted. To him and to every other pompous fool who's treated my staff like they're less than human. But I understand why you didn't. Bills don't pay themselves. Grandmothers need medicine. Survival trumps dignity most days. Amélie's eyes widened. How did you? I know everything that happens in this restaurant, Corinne said simply, including which of my staff sends half their paycheck to elderly relatives in Hochelaga Maisonneuve, including who's been working doubles without complaint for 5 years, including who has a literature degree from Concordia and writes poetry on her breaks. The revelation that Corinne knew these intimate details of her life should have felt invasive, but instead it felt oddly comforting. To be seen, truly seen, by someone who mattered. Here's what's going to happen, Corinne said, refilling both glasses. Henri is competent but weak. He's been head waiter for 12 years, and he'll be head waiter until he retires, because he's good at managing the floor but terrible at managing people. What I need is someone who can do both. Someone who understands that service is not servitude, that dignity is not negotiable, that respect flows in all directions. She let that hang in the air for a moment. I'm offering you a position as assistant manager, Corinne said. Salary, not hourly. Benefits. A real path forward. You'll train under me for 6 months, learn how I built this place, learn how to run it. And eventually, when I'm ready to step back completely, you'll take over day-to-day operations. Amélie felt the world tilt. Madam, I'm just a waitress. I don't have any management experience. You have something better, Corinne said. You have principle. You have courage. You have the kind of loyalty that comes from truly caring about something rather than just extracting value from it. Everything else can be taught. She paused. Unless you'd prefer to continue waiting tables? No, Amélie said quickly. Yes. Thank you. Yes, I accept. Corinne smiled, and it transformed her face, revealing warmth that the business persona usually kept hidden. Good. You start the new position Monday. For tonight, finish your shift. But Amélie, no more making yourself small. No more swallowing insults. No more apologizing for taking up space. Those days are over. They returned to the dining room together, and the atmosphere had shifted. The remaining guests were animated, energized by the drama they'd witnessed. As Amélie moved back to her section, she found that people were looking at her differently, not as invisible staff but as someone who had done something remarkable. The elderly woman at table 17 caught her hand as she passed. That was magnificent, she said quietly. I've been waiting 40 years to see someone do what you just did. Thank you. The young professionals at table 15 insisted on shaking her hand, each of them sharing stories of times they'd wished they'd stood up to bullies but hadn't. They left her a tip that was double their bill. The anniversary couple at table 14 wrote on their receipt, "For dignity and courage, thank you for reminding us what both look like." But it was Marcus who pulled her aside in the kitchen, his eyes bright with something that might have been tears. "Do you know what you just did?" he asked. "For all of us? Every time someone treats us like we're nothing, we remember we're not. Because you showed them. You showed all of them." The rest of the shift passed in a blur of congratulations and questions and whispered speculation about what would happen next. Henri avoided her, his expression caught between resentment and grudging respect. The other servers treated her with a mixture of admiration and wariness, as if she'd revealed herself to be something other than what they'd thought. When Amélie finally left the restaurant at 2 in the morning, she found Montreal transformed. Or perhaps she was the one transformed, seeing the city with new eyes. The streets of downtown gleamed with recent rain, reflecting the lights of buildings and passing cars. The air smelled of coming autumn, that particular Montreal scent of changing leaves, and the St. Lawrence, and 1,000 different cooking smells from 1,000 different cuisines. She walked to the metro station, her feet aching but her heart inexplicably light. On the train heading east toward Hochelaga-Maisonneuve, she composed a text to her grandmother. "Something happened tonight. Something good. I'll tell you everything tomorrow. But Grandmere, you were right. They couldn't take how I speak. Not unless I let them." The response came seconds later, despite the late hour. "Ma fière petite fille. I always knew. My proud granddaughter. I always knew." Amélie pressed her forehead against the cool window of the metro car and let herself feel it. The fear and exhilaration and exhaustion and hope all tangled together. She thought about the Sheikh, wherever he was now, and wondered if he understood what had happened. If he realized that money couldn't insulate him from consequence. If he would change his behavior or simply find restaurants where the staff were more thoroughly broken, more completely silenced. She thought about Corinne, and the revelation that someone had been watching, waiting, seeing potential where Amélie herself had seen only survival. She thought about her literature degree, her poetry, the life she'd put on hold because bills needed paying and grandmothers needed care and dreams were luxuries for people with safety nets. But mostly she thought about the moment she'd chosen to speak. The moment she'd decided that her dignity was worth more than her job security. The moment she'd reached into the well of her education and her heritage and her grandmother's fierce pride and pulled up the courage to say, "No, not anymore, not ever again." The metro car rattled through the tunnel beneath Montreal, carrying her toward home and rest and whatever came next. Through the window, she caught glimpses of the underground stations flashing past. Berry-UQAM, Frontenac, Prefontaine, each one a node in the city's circulatory system, connecting neighborhoods and lives and stories. When she finally reached her studio apartment, she found she couldn't sleep despite the exhaustion that weighed on her bones. Instead, she sat at her small desk and opened her journal, the one where she kept her poetry, her observations, her secret self. She wrote about the Sheikh, but not with anger or bitterness. She wrote about the prison of wealth, about how money could insulate someone so completely from consequence that they forgot how to see other people as human. She wrote about the loneliness of power, the isolation of believing you were special rather than simply lucky. She wrote about pity, which surprised her. Pity for a man who would never know what it felt like to be genuinely seen and respected rather than simply accommodated and tolerated. Then she wrote about Corinne, about the long line of immigrant women who had built lives in the city through sheer stubborn will. About her grandmother and Corinne's grandmother and all the invisible. Women who had raised children and learned new languages and survived wars and depressions and the casual cruelties of the powerful. She wrote until the first light of dawn began to filter through her window, until her hand cramped and her eyes burned. She wrote herself into understanding, into clarity, into the recognition that tonight had been an ending but also a beginning. When she finally slept, she dreamed in French, the French of her grandmother, mixed with the French of literature, mixed with the French of Montreal streets. She dreamed of restaurants where servers were treated with dignity, of cities where respect flowed freely, of a world where speaking truth carried no cost. The story of what happened at Le Jardin d'Étoiles spread through Montreal's restaurant community like wildfire through dry kindling. By Monday morning, when Amélie was supposed to begin her new position as assistant manager, the incident had already become legend, growing in the telling until there were versions where she quoted Voltaire at the Sheikh, versions where she delivered her rebuke entirely in classical Arabic, versions where she'd physically escorted him from the premises. The truth, as truth usually is, was both more modest and more profound than the legend. But what mattered was that people were talking, and what they were talking about was respect. How it was given, how it was withheld, how it could be demanded even by those who supposedly had no power to demand anything. Amélie arrived at the restaurant at 9 in the morning, 3 hours before the lunch service would begin. She wore the only suit she owned, bought secondhand from a consignment shop in Mile End, altered by her grandmother's still-skilled hands to fit properly. She felt like she was wearing a costume, playing at being someone she wasn't yet sure she could become. Corinne was already there, seated at table 7, the Sheikh's table, with papers spread before her and a coffee service that smelled of chicory and dark roast. She looked up as Amélie entered and gestured to the seat across from her. "First lesson," Corinne said without preamble. "Never apologize for being early. It shows respect for other people's time and standards for your own. Sit." Amélie sat. Corinne poured her a cup of coffee and pushed across a folder thick with documents. "Your education begins now," she said. "Inside that folder you'll find staff files, supplier contracts, health inspection reports, profit and loss statements, reservation systems, everything that makes this restaurant function. Your job for the next week is to read all of it. Understand how money flows in and out, understand the rhythms of service, understand the people." "That's a lot to absorb in a week," Amélie said, opening the folder and immediately feeling overwhelmed by the density of information. "You're a woman who read Proust for pleasure," Corinne replied. "I think you can handle some accounting spreadsheets. Besides, you've been here 5 years. You already understand more than you think. Now you're just going to understand the why behind the what." Over the next several hours, Corinne walked Amélie through the architecture of restaurant operations. She explained the negotiations with suppliers, the constant balancing act between quality and cost. She showed her the staff schedules and explained the careful choreography required to ensure adequate coverage without excessive labor costs. She revealed the margins, tighter than Amélie had imagined, and the constant pressure from landlords, from health inspectors, from changing neighborhood demographics, from the simple mathematical reality that most restaurants failed within their first 5 years. "The food is only part of it," Corinne explained. "Maybe not even the most important part. The real work is creating an experience where people feel valued, and that includes the staff. A restaurant where the servers are miserable creates miserable food, miserable service, miserable everything. It radiates out from the kitchen and the floor into the guest's experience." She pulled out another document, a staff survey from 3 months prior. "Look at these numbers. 30% turnover in the last year. That's lower than industry standard, but it's still too high. People leave because they're burned out, because they're treated poorly, because they see no path forward. Henri is good at managing shifts, but he doesn't understand how to build loyalty, how to make people want to stay." "And you think I can?" Amélie asked. "I think you understand what it means to be at the bottom of the hierarchy," Corinne said bluntly. "I think you know what it feels like when someone treats you as disposable. That's not something that can be taught from a textbook. That's lived knowledge, and it's more valuable than any business degree." At noon, the staff began arriving for the lunch prep. Amélie felt their eyes on her as she sat at table 7 with Corinne, no longer one of them but not yet clearly anything else, caught in transition, occupying an uncomfortable liminal space. Marcus was first to approach during a break in the prep work. He slid into the seat beside her with the easy familiarity of years of working together. "So it's true then? You're management now." "Assistant manager," Amélie said, the title still feeling strange in her mouth. "Training under Madame Beaumont." Marcus nodded slowly. "That's good. That's really good. But Amélie, don't forget us. Don't forget what it's like down here." "I won't," she promised, and meant it with everything in her. But forgetting wasn't the danger, she was learning. The danger was in becoming comfortable with the distance that hierarchy created. The danger was in starting to see people as problems to be managed rather than individuals to be respected. The danger was in becoming the very thing she'd fought against. Over the next days and weeks, Amélie discovered that management was a different kind of exhaustion than service work. The physical toll was less, no more 14-hour shifts on her feet, but the mental load was constant and complex. She learned to read the subtle dynamics between staff members, the alliances and tensions that shaped how work got done. She learned to mediate disputes, to balance competing needs, to make decisions that inevitably disappointed someone. She learned that Henri resented her promotion deeply, saw it as a judgment on his own capabilities and a threat to his position. He remained professionally correct in their interactions but maintained an icy distance, following her instructions with a precision that bordered on malicious compliance. She learned that several of the servers looked at her with hope, seeing her promotion as evidence that there was a path upward, that hard work and principle could be rewarded. Their hope was touching and also terrifying. What if she failed? What if she couldn't live up to what she represented? She learned that the kitchen staff, led by Marcus, had adopted her as a kind of folk hero. They'd started calling her La Resistant, the resistant one, a nickname that made her both proud and uncomfortable. She didn't want to be a symbol. She just wanted to do good work and be treated with dignity. But the city had other ideas about what her story meant. On Tuesday of her second week, a reporter from the Montreal Gazette contacted the restaurant, asking to interview the waitress who stood up to the sheik. Amélie declined through Corinne's office, uncomfortable with the attention. But the story ran anyway, cobbled together from interviews with diners who'd been present that night, each adding their own embellishments and interpretations. By Wednesday, a food blogger with a substantial following had written a piece titled The French Connection: How One Server's Courage Changed the Conversation About Service Work. The piece quoted labor organizers and sociologists, turning Amélie's moment of self-defense into a broader commentary on class, respect, and the treatment of service workers in fine dining. By Friday, Le Jardin d'Étoiles was booked solid for the next 3 weeks. Reservations were pouring in, many of them specifically requesting to be seated in Amélie's section, though she explained patiently that she was no longer working the floor. People wanted to be part of the story, wanted to say they'd been there, wanted to demonstrate their own progressive values by eating at the restaurant where the waitress had talked back. Corinne watched this unfold with a mixture of amusement and calculation. "This is good for business," she said. "But it's also dangerous. People are coming for the story, not the food. That attention will fade. We need to make sure they come back because the experience is genuinely good, not because they're chasing social media clout." The attention wasn't entirely positive. On Saturday, a competing restaurant owner, a man who'd been accused multiple times of sexual harassment by his staff, published an editorial in a business journal criticizing Corinne for allowing staff to abuse customers and creating a hostile environment for high-end clientele. The editorial was transparent in its motives but still stung. More troubling were the private messages Amélie began receiving on social media. Some were supportive, sharing similar stories of mistreatment and expressing gratitude that someone had finally fought back. But others were viciously cruel, calling her arrogant, ungrateful, presumptuous. Several suggested she should be put back in her place. One included her grandmother's address and a thinly veiled threat about respecting her elders. That one Amélie reported to the police, though she knew from experience that little would come of it. The officer who took her statement was kind but clear-eyed about the limits of what they could do. "We'll document it," he said. "But unless there's an actual threat of immediate harm, there's not much we can pursue. Be careful on social media. Maybe lock down your privacy settings." She did, but the damage to her sense of security had already been done. She'd stood up to the sheik in a moment of righteous anger, but she hadn't fully considered the consequences beyond that moment. She'd assumed the worst that could happen was losing her job. She hadn't anticipated becoming a symbol, a lightning rod, a focal point for every argument about class and service and who had the right to speak truth to power. Her grandmother, when Amélie finally told her everything, was both proud and worried. They sat in Marguerite's small apartment, drinking tea from cups that had been wedding gifts 60 years prior, the afternoon light slanting through lace curtains that Marguerite had made herself. "You've done something important, ma chérie," Marguerite said, her arthritic hands wrapped around her teacup for warmth. "You've reminded people that respect is not optional, that dignity belongs to everyone. But," and here her voice grew stern, "you must be careful. The powerful do not like being reminded that their power has limits. They will find ways to punish you, even if they can't do so directly." "I know," Amélie said. "I'm already seeing it. But Grandmere, I couldn't stay silent. Not after he said those things. Not after years of swallowing every insult, every dismissal, every casual cruelty. Something in me just broke. Or maybe it healed. I'm not sure which." Marguerite reached across the table and took Amélie's hand, her grip surprisingly strong despite the twisted fingers. "You know what your great-grandmother told me when I was a girl in Lyon?" She said, "There are two kinds of breaking, the breaking that destroys and the breaking that creates space for something new to grow. I think you experienced the second kind." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, the city sounds drifting up from the street below. Children playing, someone practicing piano, the distant wail of an ambulance. "Tell me about this promotion," Marguerite said. "This Madame Beaumont, she's treating you well?" "Better than well," Amélie said. "She's teaching me everything. How to read financials, how to manage staff, how to handle suppliers. It's overwhelming sometimes, but it's also," she paused, searching for the right word, "this possibility. For the first time in years, I feel like I'm moving toward something instead of just surviving." "Good," Marguerite said firmly. "But don't lose yourself in the moving. Don't become so focused on where you're going that you forget who you are and where you came from." The warning was prescient. As the weeks continued and Amélie grew more comfortable in her role, she found herself facing temptations she hadn't anticipated. It would be easy to distance herself from the servers, to adopt the perspective of management, to start seeing labor costs instead of people, to prioritize efficiency over empathy. She saw it happening to herself in small ways. Getting annoyed when someone called in sick, being frustrated by requests for schedule changes, feeling impatient with the minor dramas that played out among the staff. She recognized these reactions as the beginning of a transformation she didn't want to complete. So she made a point of working one service shift each week on the floor, keeping herself grounded in the physical reality of the work. She ate staff meals in the kitchen with Marcus and the line cooks. She learned everyone's names, their stories, their struggles outside of work. She instituted a policy where any staff member could request a private meeting with her to discuss concerns without fear of retaliation. The meetings revealed problems she hadn't known existed. A busser who'd been quietly enduring racist comments from a regular customer. A prep cook whose housing situation was precarious and who'd been sleeping in his car some nights. A server who was being sexually harassed by Henri and was too afraid of losing her job to report it. That last revelation hit Amélie like a physical blow. The server, a young woman named Julie who'd been at the restaurant for 8 months, came to Amélie's office pale and shaking, the words tumbling out in a rush. Henri had been making inappropriate comments, finding excuses to touch her, implying that her schedule and section assignments depended on her being friendly. Amélie listened with a rage that was cold and focused. The same rage she'd felt facing the Sheikh, but even more intense because this was happening in her restaurant, under her watch, to someone she was supposed to protect. "Thank you for telling me," she said when Julie finished. "I know how hard this was. I want you to know that I believe you, that this is absolutely unacceptable, and that there will be consequences." "Please don't fire him," Julie said quickly, fear sharp in her voice. "He'll know it was me. He'll make sure I never work in a good restaurant again. He has connections, he knows people." "Julie, look at me." Amélie waited until the younger woman's eyes met hers. "The only person who should be afraid right now is Henri. You did nothing wrong. You're not going to lose anything. But he is." She reported the harassment to Corinne immediately, along with documentation of the meeting and a recommendation for immediate termination. Corinne listened with a grim expression that suggested she was angry but not surprised. "How did I not see this?" she asked, more to herself than to Amélie. 12 years he's been here. How did I miss it? Because men like Henri are very good at hiding their behavior from people who have power over them, Amélie said. He only shows his true face to people he thinks can't fight back. That's how this works. Corinne nodded slowly. You're right. And you're right about termination. Document everything. I'll speak with our lawyer. Henri is done here. The confrontation happened the next day in Corinne's office, with both Amélie and the restaurant's lawyer present. Henri arrived expecting a routine meeting about scheduling, but his expression transformed when he saw the assembled group and the folder of documentation on Corinne's desk. What is this? He asked, but his voice held the tremor of someone who already knew. This is a termination meeting, Corinne said calmly. We've received credible allegations of sexual harassment. We've conducted an investigation. The evidence is clear. You're fired, effective immediately. Henri's face cycled through denial, anger, and finally calculation. You can't do this. I've been here 12 years. I know things about how this place runs. I have connections in this city. If you fire me, You'll what? Amélie interrupted. Tell people that you were fired for sexually harassing staff? Please do. I'm sure that will do wonders for your career prospects. Henri's eyes focused on her with pure venom. This is your doing. That night with the sheik went to your head. You think you're special now, think you can do whatever you want. But you're just a waitress playing dress-up. You'll never be management. They'll see through you eventually. I already am management, Amélie said quietly. And one of my jobs is to ensure that people like you can't hurt people anymore. Security is waiting to escort you out. You have 10 minutes to collect your personal items. Henri stood, his face purple with rage, but the lawyer's presence kept him from doing anything more than glaring. As he stalked toward the door, he turned back one last time. You'll regret this, he said. Both of you. I doubt it, Corinne replied. Goodbye, Henri. The door closed behind him, and Amélie felt something release in her chest. Tension she hadn't realized she'd been carrying. She'd just made a powerful enemy, but she'd also done the right thing. Sometimes those two facts coexisted, and you had to be okay with that. News of Henri's firing spread through the restaurant within hours. The reaction was complex. Some staff members had liked Henri, respected his competence, and were shocked by the allegations. Others came forward with their own stories, creating a flood of revelations about behavior that had been tolerated, normalized, hidden. Julie wasn't his only victim. 2 other servers and a hostess described similar patterns of harassment. The evidence had always been there, Amélie realized. People had just chosen not to see it because seeing it would require action, and action was complicated and uncomfortable. The 3 months following Henri's termination transformed Le Jardin d'Étoiles in ways both visible and invisible. On the surface, operations continued smoothly, perhaps even more smoothly without Henri's brittle anxiety permeating the floor. But underneath, something fundamental had shifted in the culture of the restaurant. Amélie promoted Marcus to floor manager, a decision that surprised him and everyone else. I'm a chef, he'd protested when she first proposed it. I belong in the kitchen. You're also someone every staff member trusts, Amélie had countered. You're someone who understands that service is skilled work that deserves respect. You can teach people not just what to do, but why it matters. That's rare, Marcus. That's valuable. He'd accepted, bringing to the front of house the same standards of excellence and mutual respect that he'd cultivated in the kitchen over 15 years. Under his management, the servers began to carry themselves differently, not with arrogance, but with quiet pride in their work. They were learning that service didn't require servility, that they could be professional and dignified simultaneously. Amélie instituted new policies: mandatory harassment training for all staff, an anonymous reporting system for problems, transparent criteria for promotions, a living wage rather than minimum wage plus tips. The last change was controversial. Several longtime servers worried they'd earn less without the potential for big tips, but Amélie structured it so the base wage was higher than their previous average, with tips becoming genuine bonuses rather than necessary income. Dignity shouldn't depend on the generosity of strangers, she explained at the staff meeting where she announced the changes. You should be able to pay your rent whether your tables were generous or not. The financial impact was significant. Labor costs increased by 18%. Corinne had been skeptical, worried about profit margins that were already thin. But they made other adjustments, streamlined the menu, renegotiated supplier contracts, raised prices by 7%. The raised prices drove away some customers, but the ones who stayed were generally the ones who appreciated quality and respected staff. And remarkably, service improved. When servers weren't performing anxiety about their rent payments, weren't calculating tips after every interaction, weren't desperately trying to charm or please or flatter, they could simply do excellent work. The atmosphere in the restaurant became more relaxed, more genuine. Guests responded to that authenticity. The story of the Sheikh had faded from social media by now, replaced by the next scandal, the next viral moment, the next outrage. But its effects lingered in quieter ways. Amélie received messages from service workers across the city, across the country, sharing their own stories of standing up to abusive customers or refusing to tolerate harassment. She became an accidental spokeswoman for a movement she hadn't intended to start. A labor organization invited her to speak at their annual conference. She was terrified but accepted, writing and rewriting her speech a dozen times. Standing before 200 service workers, she told her story but focused less on the confrontation itself and more on what came after. The systemic changes, the culture shift, the recognition that individual acts of courage meant nothing without institutional transformation. I got lucky, she told the audience. I had an owner who supported me, who saw possibility instead of liability. But most of you won't have that. Most of you will stand up for yourselves and get fired, and that's not acceptable. We need stronger labor protections. We need industry standards that make respect mandatory, not optional. We need to stop treating service work as something people do while waiting for a real job and start recognizing it as skilled labor that deserves dignity and fair compensation. The speech was received with a standing ovation, and afterward, dozens of people approached her with questions, stories, requests for advice. She exchanged contact information with organizers, connected servers across different restaurants, began building networks of mutual support. It was exhausting and exhilarating in equal measure. Amélie was working 60-hour weeks between her management duties and this unexpected advocacy role. Her grandmother worried she was burning out, and she wasn't wrong. But Amélie felt like she'd found something she didn't know she'd been searching for. Purpose that extended beyond simple survival. Her poetry changed during this period. She wrote less about observation and more about action, less about quiet endurance and more about the possibility of transformation. One poem, written at 3 in the morning after a particularly difficult shift, began with the lines, "They told us silence was survival, that the small must make themselves smaller, that speaking truth was a luxury, reserved for those who could afford the cost. But what if survival is not enough? What if we were meant for more than swallowing indignities like bitter pills, smiling through gritted teeth, pretending our erasure doesn't hurt?" She shared the poem at an open mic night in Mile End, her voice shaking at first but growing stronger with each line. The coffee shop was packed with artists and students and service workers, and when she finished, the silence lasted several heartbeats before erupting into applause. A young woman approached her afterward, eyes bright with tears. "I quit my job last week," she said. "My boss was, well, he was like your sheik except every single day. I've been terrified that I made the wrong choice, that I should have just kept my head down. But hearing you tonight, thank you. Thank you for saying it's okay to choose dignity." These moments sustained Amélie through the difficult days, and there were many difficult days. 6 months after Henri's termination, he filed a wrongful termination lawsuit against the restaurant, claiming the harassment allegations were fabricated and that his firing was retaliation for unspecified complaints he'd made about management. The lawsuit was transparently vindictive, but it still had to be defended. Lawyers were expensive. Depositions were time-consuming. The process dragged on for months, creating. The lawsuit eventually collapsed under the weight of evidence and multiple corroborating testimonies. Henri disappeared from Montreal's restaurant scene. 2 years later, Le Jardin d'Étoiles thrived under Amélie's leadership, a model for ethical service work. She still visited her grandmother every Sunday, still wrote poetry in the quiet hours before dawn. The sheik never returned, but others did, guests who came because they'd heard this was a place where respect flowed in all directions. Amélie had learned that speaking truth had costs, but silence cost more. She'd chosen dignity and built something worth keeping. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel.